So is there a type of psychotherapy or counselling that suits men better than women? I think there is. It's called REBT, Rational Emotive Behaviour Therapy. It's a forerunner of CBT, Cognitive Behavioural Therapy, and it was invented by a guy called Albert Ellis, who was absolutely hilarious, totally non-woke, politically incorrect, a New York Jew, probably born in the 1920s. I think he died around 2000, so when he was quite old already. So he was a big player in the therapy world in the 60s, 70s, 80s. He's since been kind of overlooked. And a common trope you'll hear these days, especially by female psychotherapists, nearly all psychotherapists and counsellors, and indeed counselling psychologists these days seem to be women. It's a very female dominant profession. And the trope that you hear a lot is CBT is shallow. Cognitive behavioural therapy or brief therapies, brief interventions are shallow and not as relevant as depth psychotherapy, where you go on and on and on and on for years talking about your childhood. A classic example would be the recent podcast Dad Saves America with Erica Commissar, a Freudian psychotherapist who's been doing the rounds of all of the podcasters and taking them in, very credulous podcasters listening on her every word. Oh yes, depth psychotherapy is the way to go. Not for men it isn't. Not for men it isn't. And the reason for that is because you might have noticed this. Men don't like to go on and on and on about their feelings or their relationships. They can talk about it, most of them, they're open to talking about it, but they want it to be done and over with relatively quickly. And of course this isn't all men and not all women aren't like that, but in general. So take for example, the classic example would be you're having problems in your relationship and she wants to keep going back to it the next day and the next day. There's more to talk about, let's go back. And he's thinking, oh my God, what, another hour of hashing over our relationship again? I mean, he'd probably rather pull off his toenails with a plier. Like, that is just a classic difference between men and women. And for that exact reason, men prefer brief interventions in therapy, solution-focused therapies that might last 10 or 15 sessions and get right to the nub of the problem and solve it. And Rational Emotive Behaviour Therapy, Albert Ellis's therapy, does exactly that. And he was quite, if you read, the best book by Albert Ellis to read is a rather unimaginatively titled book called Rational Emotive Behaviour Therapy. It worked for me, it can work for you too. Which has got to be about the worst book title ever. But funnily enough, it's an incredibly interesting book. Most of his books are really dull, but that book's an autobiography in which he goes into how he developed his therapies, and it's from a very male perspective. He had dreadful parents, as a lot of famous psychologists tend to do, and his parents were a couple of totally irresponsible New York socialites. They were secular Jews. They had no time for children. They spent all their time partying and going out on the Upper East Side or whatever it was. He was brought up in the Bronx, which in those days was middle class. And he even had a period in his childhood where he was in hospital for like a year, really ill, and they hardly ever came to visit. So can you imagine how many years of therapy the average modern person would have to get over that? He turned it into a strength, and he developed a stoic way of solving his problems kind of on his own. And he also discovered that going around and talking to the other kids in the hospital and kind of trying to cheer them up was very therapeutic for him. But he also discovered a technique of rational self-reflection, or what's more accurately really Socratic dialogue, question and answer, that he would sit and do with himself, whiling away those hours in his hospital bed. It's incredibly stoic. It's a very stoic type of philosophy, which is why it appeals to men. And his primary technique is called ABC, and it works like this. So you can do this in your head or on a piece of paper. A stands for adversity or activator. It's the thing that's triggering you. It's the problem. So if you don't have a problem and you don't have any disturbed feelings going on, you don't need to do an ABC. And you probably don't need to be in therapy, do you? So this is obviously is for people who've got a problem and it's disturbing them emotionally, right? So the first thing you look for is one of those two things, the trigger or the emotion. So A is the trigger, the activator, the adversity, the thing that's needling you or causing the problem. Or if you don't even know what that is, you can just jump straight to C, which is the consequence. A consequence, C, is always an emotion, a disturbed emotion, a negative emotion, an unhealthy negative emotion, let's call it that. So an example would be, your C is, I'm feeling ill at ease, like I'm not doing anything with my life and I'm going nowhere. Ill at ease, ashamed of myself, annoyed with self, something like that. After a bit of reflecting, you can realize this is because 3 nights ago you had a conversation with a much more successful friend who's the same age as you. And ever since then you've been feeling out of sorts. So your conversation with your friend is the A, is the activator of your emotion. And your emotion is the consequence of that activator, C. So that's about as far as most people get. Something activates them and there's an emotional consequence to that. They feel disturbed. And that's as far as most people get. They don't investigate it any further than that. But Albert Ellis would say A does not equal C. There's something in between, and that's your belief system. So A plus B equals C. In other words, in the old Stoic mantra, as you think, so you are, which is also a quote attributed to the Buddha and God knows how many other people. So all of these philosophies, Buddhism, Christianity, Stoicism, 12 steps, they're all Stoic. They're all essentially Stoic, and they're all very much anti the modern therapy age, which wants to excavate and investigate and talk endlessly for weeks and months and years on end about the same thing and the same relationship, the same problem, and investigate it from every angle and ultimately get nowhere. That is the type of therapy that predominates. And to be fair, that is a strategy of emotional processing that mostly women, not exclusively women, but mostly women do like to do, because it's almost like through that process that they process their feelings, and that's completely legit. And eventually it will resolve itself. But most men don't like to do that at all, which is why they don't really like therapy much. But this technique, ABC, is the complete opposite. So you go straight to the solution, which in this case is the belief system. As I think, so I am. So back to this example, the chap has had a conversation with somebody that's made him reflect on himself, none too kindly. And now he's all emotionally disturbed and unhappy with himself, has a feeling like he's stuck. Now, it's the belief system that has caused him to feel stuck. So we could ask him, when you had that conversation with your friend, what sort of things were you thinking to yourself, which is commonly known as self-talk? And he might think about it a little bit and then say, well, I was thinking that I'm not as good as him. Okay, great, so we write that down. Literally in speech marks, I'm not as good as him. And then we test that, we dispute it. So this is actually ABCDE. The A is your friend in your conversation. The B belief system is I'm not as good as him. The consequence, the emotion is I feel crappy about myself. But the dispute is, am I really not as good as him? Is it just that his career is very successful? Actually, I have kids and a happy marriage. He's a bachelor still. So I'm more successful in terms of creating the next generation. Actually, I've got a lot more pastimes than he does. I'm into mountaineering and I've climbed several mountains. He doesn't have time for that because of his career. And if we jump far enough forward, we could perhaps see that I may die a more content man than him, because he may never marry, may never have kids, may never develop any passions or pastimes or interests, may never travel or see anything or build any memories, all because he's relentlessly pursuing this goal. And one way or another, we can balance it out a bit more and realize it's not quite as simple as I'm not as good as him. I just felt in that moment on that particular topic that I didn't quite measure up to him. And that's what Albert Ellis would say, is you're never going to completely erase your disturbed feelings. When you think of your friend, you're never probably going to feel completely at ease, because he's always going to be challenging to you because he is incredibly successful, right? But what you're going to do is you're going to get it more into perspective. Yes, he's incredibly successful, and I am not majorly successful in my career. I'm averagely successful. So obviously he sometimes makes me feel a bit insignificant. But if I look at it rationally from every angle, I can see that success is defined much more widely than that, and I am quite accomplished in a number of other ways. So it's not that black and white. So you've got A, B, C, and ending in your D, dispute there. The final bit you'll do is E, effective new belief and action. So if it is true that I feel slightly unaccomplished, then there's maybe stuff I can do about that, and I can build an effective new strategy, effective new actions, or paradoxical behaviors. I'm going to act in the opposite way I usually do. Instead of just getting angry about that, I'm going to develop a new income stream, or I'm going to do something about that. So that's the type of therapy that, in my experience, tends to suit men a lot better than endless person-centered depth psychotherapy, where you go on endlessly about your feelings, digging around in your childhood for traumas and things which can't ultimately be resolved and don't ultimately lead to you feeling better, especially not if you're a man, because that's not how you process your emotions. Women often process their emotions by talking about it and talking about every angle of it, and maybe they need to do that, but most men tend to become quite frustrated quite quickly with having to emote endlessly or talk for a great number of hours about an emotion or a relationship. That's not how men tend to solve their emotional difficulties. Beyond literal psychotherapies, obviously men have a range of other things that can be therapeutic and are therapeutic in a way that is quite different really to how most women achieve emotional and mental health. Physical activities outdoors with other men, the classic shed sort of phenomena, having a place to go and be creative without lots of talking happening. Men tend to like quiet more than women in general, and things like weightlifting, which of course is a bit of a meme and a bit of a cliche at the moment, that things like weightlifting are therapy for men, but they literally are for young men in particular. For a young man in particular, something like weightlifting is a blueprint for discipline. He may struggle to be disciplined in any other area of his life, but if he can apply it to this one area and he sees not immediate results but relatively fast results and his body starts to change, then applying himself there is obviously a transferable skill, and it's a pretty easy, lifting weights is a pretty easy thing to learn how to do and become disciplined at, right? And so if you can do that, you can transfer that skill of applying yourself to any other area. So that is, I think, is the most therapeutic thing about lifting weights for young men in particular, is many times it's the first place, the first arena in which they learn to apply themselves, and in that sense it's therapeutic. So just a few ideas of things that can be more therapeutic for men that are sort of well known really, and they're a cliche for a reason, because men do recreate themselves literally in sheds, fixing things and finding solutions to things is very therapeutic for men. Well, literal psychotherapy is the same in my experience for men. They want it to fairly rapidly move toward a solution that they can understand and to put things back in their proper order. So I hope that helps.